Greetings, fencers. So in this video I wanted to go over some of the manuscripts I use, some information about them and where to find them. All of them can be found on Liechtenauer, but I find it difficult to search sometimes, and there are advantages to having a paper copy or in a PDF document. First, I do want to say that I'm not an expert on the information around the manuscripts. You can find long, in-depth papers on them, but know that we don't actually know a whole lot. It's a lot of educated guesses. Many are anonymous and not dated. And when looking at niche things like historical fencing, these manuscripts are like looking into a room through a keyhole. There's lots we don't know for sure, but with lots of research into all aspects of life and culture at the time, we can start to widen that keyhole into more of a window. So Johannes Liechtenauer traveled to learn from different masters, then eventually started teaching fencing in secret to the high class. He specifically didn't want others to know his art. We have no direct text written by him, or even know when he lived. Could have been any time in the 1300s or early 1400s, and no student that we found was ever expressly stated as a direct student of his. What we do have from Liechtenauer is a recital, the Zettel, a series of verses in rhyme that helped students remember what he taught them, specifically made cryptic so as not to let others understand it. Students started writing gloss, or details explaining each verse, and we would see these manuscripts be copied and kept and compiled over the next 200 years. Liechtenauer became regarded as the grand master of the German fighting tradition. We'll go through some of the main sources I use, and they'll all be linked below. So one of the main manuscripts that I read is a compiled house book that's generally referred to as 3227A. It used to be called Dobringer, often because the name Hanko Dobringer appears as one of the other masters in a section after the Zettel part. It's anonymous and not dated. You'll see it dated to 1389, but it could be up to 1494. We just don't know for sure. If it was from the 1300s, it would likely be the oldest source on the Zettel found. One reason why it's really good is because it has a really great intro that's a must read. It doesn't have gloss under each verse, but when it does, it is really substantial and detailed and has information that I haven't come across in other manuscripts. It's written by a very opinionated student and explains some things in detail that aren't covered as much by other students. One important part is it's in a different German dialect, leading to translating being more difficult. It's important to read multiple translations. An example I found is I've seen the word Kreuz used, and one translated that as cross, the other as Zwerg, or thwart, and Zecken to tag, or withdraw, which changes how you read it. Another main source I use is from the Dresden Codex from the early 1500s, the Sigmund ein Ringeck. He wrote the longsword section in it that was then put into that book, and more copies of Ringeck's works are compiled into books throughout the 1500s. Both Mair and Meyer had copies of it. We don't know when he wrote it originally. Ringeck says he was serving Albrecht, Duke of Bavaria, which there are 4 from 1353 to 1508. His gloss and explanations are generally easy to follow though, and pretty substantial. It really helps getting multiple perspectives for the gloss, and this is a great one to have and very important. There are some gloss that are less substantial than other manuscripts, which is one of the reasons why this shouldn't be the only one someone reads. Now we get to one of the earliest, most substantial fight books, Codex 44A8. Written in 1452, it has 3 anonymous sections generally accredited to pseudo Peter von Danzig, 4 sections by André Lignitzer, 4 sections by Martin Hansfeld, grappling by Ott, and finally another half-sword section by the actual Peter von Danzig. The recital and gloss are one of the most widely copied and used throughout the 14 and 1500s. There are 3 substantial versions that have been found, usually referred to as branch A, B, and C, with copies based off those. The Ringeck verses and gloss are very similar, that some think that he may have been the anonymous author or based his off one of these. It is a very substantial gloss that explains a lot and is often heavy on detail, and if you're wanting to read early Zettel sources, this would be a must read along with the previous 2. People do like to discuss the specifics of manuscripts and the differences, but in the grand scheme of things, they're all pretty much the same. Liechtenauer's verses are so well preserved across the century that there isn't really a lot of change. Even if words are changed a little in some, the meaning is still the same. I have 2 paper copies of it. One is the whole codex by Christian Tobler. It's written in a way to sound better in English. He went deeper translating it, but shouldn't be your only translation because there are a couple spots that I didn't agree with. And I also have one that is very interesting. Learned about it from Martin Fabian. He wrote the foreword. It's written to rhyme in English. The meaning is still the same, but you can feel some of the flow that original students would have had. And my favorite book to work from is a PDF made by Hroarr that compiles all 3, 3227A, Ringeck, and von Danzig together on each page. Huge thanks to them for making that. Another substantial manuscript is the Jude Lew compiled book from the 1460s and is very similar to von Danzig that I'll be reading through in the future. It's very easy to read through and would be a good first Zettel manuscript as well. And another manuscript I'll be going through is Hans Medal. No date when it was written. It was eventually compiled by Hector Mair in the 1500s. It has a lot of gloss and some very unique things, and an added 7 stanzas sections. The parts after the changing through were lost, however. Getting into the Renaissance, we start to see some different things. Paulus Hector Mair has some very substantial codexes and gathered many manuscripts mentioned above, one being the Wallenstein Codex. He also wrote a very substantial fight book using many different weapons. We see him, instead of basing everything off the Zettel gloss format, he instead picks out plays and has a picture with each one. 136 in his longsword section. And we see some things not shown in earlier sources. I personally haven't gone through Mair's book, so I won't comment too much. I plan to one day go through it. And finally, the latest longsword source I studied is Joachim Meyer. He was more likely of humble birth and wanted to keep Liechtenauer's tradition alive. He wrote in 1560, a personal training book in 1568, and his culminating life's work in 1570. It was the first manuscript I read, and it's one of the few in the German system that's actually intended to teach people from the ground up. There's still lots of assumed knowledge because we don't see people with swords day to day, but it's written so you can learn the concepts of fencing clearly. Lots of direct advice as well as examples for everything and numerous plays. He even wrote a version of the Zettel for his time. If you're struggling to read early Zettel sources, then I would highly recommend reading Art of Combat 1570 to get a bit of the basics. We do see in Meyer's day a different context. Longswords are found less and less in Mortal Kombat, and we know Meyer ran fencing tournaments, so there are some differences in his system, but in my opinion, I don't think it's different enough to not be usable. Now, some other manuscripts from the tradition are Hans Lekuchner's fight books, 1478 and 1482. They go through long knife, or any cut and thrust one-hand sword, and it is one of the most substantial manuscripts I've seen. It follows along with Liechtenauer's Zettel for the most part, and has 456 plays, with most having a picture. Now, one of the first things people notice is it has a lot of in-depth grappling. That's because you're at a closer range with just a knife. And because it shows the same grappling from holding different parts, blade, handle, hand, elbow, etc., so that no matter where you grab, you hopefully have a muscle memory reaction with it, and the same done for all counters. And another really substantial manuscript is the Gladiatoria manuscripts. They don't follow a Zettel, but show a large amount of plays for in-armor dueling. It's my favorite to look at for that specific context. It has that famous play, if you want to end them quickly, about throwing your pommel, which, when reading it all together with the plays, it doesn't really stand out as that weird. And finally, we have tons of manuscripts by guys like Paulus Kahl, Hans Talhofer, Cluny, Peter Faulkner, that have very little or no text, but instead are mostly pictures, and also aren't usually laid out in the manner of the Zettel, but instead just different plays and techniques they liked. Maybe illiteracy was the source of this, so they thought it wasn't worth putting large paragraphs. These manuscripts really aren't going to be useful starting off, but once you know the Zettel, fencing, and the concepts of fighting, then you can go through these numerous small texts, and that will give you some new ideas and a new look at things. I do understand why some may want to only learn from one source, but I'm not in that group. I want to learn from anything I can. If we use an example with a couple modern skilled fencers, it would be like when Martin Fabian's teaching and I turn away saying, no, I only listen to Axel Pettersson. I want to learn from every skilled fencer, especially when it's in this system, so I want to read from every Zettel source that I can find. It's important to spend enough time in it to understand the system and not just grabbing things randomly. That's why I also learn from Fiore's Flower of Battle manuscripts, to hear what another skilled fencer has to say. If you only look at one, you're stuck looking through that keyhole. We're told that both Liechtenauer and Fiore both traveled and learned from different masters. And that's the story of some other martial arts as well, and pretty much any skill. You rarely hear a story of someone who just stayed at home learning from one skilled person. It's always that someone traveled to learn in different environments, contexts, and from different people, because that's where art and skill comes from. And I find the advice and concepts and what fighting could look like as more important to look at than just the specific plays. The advice that I let fill me before my first tournament was in Meyer's Zettel. See that you are first in the field. Before your opponent adopts a posture, lay on against him. Pay heed to instantly, understand me rightly, hit him before he adopts a posture. And the other, a supposed quote by Liechtenauer in the gloss. If you stop moving, you're dead. That's what I had my coach say in my ear between rounds because he doesn't know how to fence. Take in advice and knowledge. Again, any links that I find will be down below. Thanks for watching, keep studying, keep practicing.